Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's panel. I'm Troy Swanson, Library Department Chair at Moraine Valley, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this panel discussion. Today, we will be focusing on the COVID-19 vaccine. We'll be discussing the biology, the public health aspects, and the psychology impacting the acceptance of the vaccine.
Hello, everyone. I'm Hannah Carlton. I am a public service librarian here at Moraine Valley. We're excited to be joined by three faculty members to help us explore this topic today. I will ask them to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Judy Corcoran. I am a nursing faculty member here at Moraine Valley Community College. I've been a nurse for 38 years. 15 of those have been teaching here at Moraine Valley. And I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
My name is Laura Lauzen-Collins. I'm a psychology faculty member here at Moraine Valley.
My name is Pete Porter. I'm an associate professor of human anatomy and physiology here at the college. I'm also a nurse.
Well, welcome to you all, and thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. To get started, I think we'll start out with the basics. Can you explain a little bit about what vaccines are and how they work? Judy, maybe you can start?
Sure. Vaccines are a way to train your immune system to fight some of the things that it might need to fight against. So vaccines have been around for a very long time. Smallpox was the initial instituting disease where it caused much pain and heartache many years ago, and hundreds of years ago, then smallpox vaccine was instituted, and that was one of the first vaccines because they realized that they could give pieces of smallpox to someone and their immune system would be then trained to fight smallpox. And over time, they realized it didn't have to be smallpox. It could be something weaker than smallpox, like cowpox. And that same training their immune system to fight cowpox also trained it to fight smallpox. And we have continued that growth and continued that knowledge until today. We have a number of vaccines to fight a variety of diseases, and many of them are extremely effective. And that system of developing a way to train your immune system to fight a disease kicked into high gear when COVID-19 came around, and we were able to have several types of vaccines that came out within a very short period of time.
Judy, I'd just like to add on that just a little bit of the science that we even teach in our anatomy classes. You know, when you expose somebody to a virus, whether it's a live virus, a weakened virus, what happens is it stimulates an immune system response in your body, and you get what's called adaptive or acquired immunity. Basically, your body produces cells and antibodies that target that specific virus that you were exposed to. And the key of that is then you get what's called immunological memory. So your body produces cells or antibodies that remember that virus ostensibly for your life. And so anytime you're ever exposed to that virus again, your body has already trained sort of an army to fight that virus off before it can really infect you. And so that's really one of the key things about vaccines, is that when you take the vaccine, stimulates that immune response. That immune response is normally lifelong.
So I'll just pose a follow-up question. We've been hearing a lot about some specific different types of vaccines, like live or not live, and specifically messenger RNA vaccines relating to the COVID vaccines. Could you talk about these different types of vaccines and how the COVID vaccine fits?
I can start, and then I'll let Pete add on to that because I'm sure his biology background, he understands it much more deeply. But the messenger RNA is a new type of vaccine. In the past, we were able to use either vaccine that had somehow been altered so that it didn't cause us to become as sick, so that our immune system could ramp up and train an army, as Pete said, to fight against that. And that's what we've been using in the past. But they've been looking at mRNA for several years now as a means of fighting against maybe cancers and things like that. But when COVID-19 came around, they realized that messenger RNA, that we could use that. The messenger RNA is actually what tells our cells to produce proteins, and we could use the messenger RNA to tell our cells to produce a spike protein, which is specific to coronaviruses, of which COVID-19 is one, and that would help train our bodies to fight against the coronaviruses without ever giving them the actual virus. So the first two vaccines that were approved those two were messenger RNA vaccines, and there's a lipid protein that carries it into the nucleus of the cell where the cell can then begin to produce the spike proteins. The Johnson & Johnson one that has been approved more recently, that is more like the historical vaccines where there is a piece of a coronavirus that is then transported into the cell. But again, it tells the cell to produce the spike proteins, and then again, the body's immune system is trained to fight against that specific protein. Take it away, Pete.
Pete, you're on mute.
So historically, there's been like two different types of vaccines that we've used. We've used live vaccines, or we've used weakened or inactivated vaccines. So the live vaccines where we'd actually expose somebody to a live virus. So like when the smallpox, they would actually give you a little bit of live smallpox and your body would react to it. And hopefully the small amount of smallpox we gave you wasn't enough to make you really sick, and your body could, build up the immunity to it, fight it off, and then have that lifelong immunity to it. So that's how live vaccines work. The weakened vaccines, or the killed vaccine form, is where we give you a dead or really a killed vaccine. So we kill the vaccine, give it to you. We kill the virus, and give it to you. But your body still mounts a response to it. It's not quite as strong a response typically, but your body will still mount a response and still give you that immunological memory to it. The problem with the killed viruses is that we've kind of found that you usually wind up needing a booster to it because the immunity kind of wanes over time. It weakens because you didn't get as strong an immune response as you would with the live vaccine. The live vaccine has a little bit more risk because you're actually giving somebody a live virus. What's cool about what Judy was saying, the mRNA, this is kind of a whole different ball game where they're giving you a genetic code. They're getting the genetic code into you either through lipoprotein or through, a genetically modified virus that doesn't make you sick, and they give it to you. And that mRNA strand, that genetic code, causes your cells to build those little protein spikes. So when you hear about the coronavirus, we've all seen the picture of the sun with the little spikes on it. That's corona. They call it the corona of the sun, those little spikes. The mRNA code causes the cells to make those little spikes, and then your body thinks it's coronavirus, even though it's not, and it reacts to it, and then you get that immunity to it. So it's a pretty cool and novel type of vaccine.
Thank you. That was a great introduction to what vaccines are.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the development process behind, how we get these vaccines out to the public. And we've heard a lot over the last year about manufacture and development. I think all of us have been reading and learning a lot across society. Just to start with, could you tell us a little bit about how vaccine trials work and how they protect the public? And maybe we could start with Pete.
Sure. Typically, in the United States, a manufacturer will be doing some trials. So before even going to the FDA, they will do some trials. They'll start with computer models, they'll give them data, and then they'll move on to animal studies to kind of study the effectiveness of the vaccine. Once they've gotten to a point where they feel that they have a viable vaccine, they'll apply to the FDA. It's called an investigational new drug application. And when they apply to the FDA, will review that and allow them to move to clinical trials. In clinical trials, these are human trials, so they actually use the vaccine on humans, and it's usually a 3-phase trial. There's phase 1 where they kind of use a small amount of people, pretty healthy people, and they'll look at sort of the safety and the effectiveness of the vaccine. Then they'll move to phase 2 where they'll broaden the horizon they'll do it more like on several hundred people. They'll look at a diversity of different people, of different demographics, different racial backgrounds, different gender, different health conditions. So they're looking at kind of broadening the vaccine use to a lot of different people to see if there's different reactions that occur. Again, looking at the safety and efficacy of it. And then in phase 3, they open that up to thousands of people. They kind of broaden the scope and look at it in even larger groups of people. Based on those 3 trials, those 3 phases, then they'll go apply to the FDA for what's called a biologics license application. And that will allow them to manufacture and distribute the vaccine. Now, COVID follow what's called the emergency use authorization application. And when you apply using the emergency use authorization application, they allow you to manufacture the vaccine while you're doing the clinical trials. So after you've done the computer models, after you've done the animal studies and applied to the FDA, while you're doing those 3 phases of clinical trials on humans, they allow you to manufacture the vaccine. They're not guaranteeing you're going to get to use it, but they allow you to manufacture it. So by the end of the clinical trials, when you go back to the FDA and present your data, if they find that your vaccine is good, safe, effective, you've already manufactured the vaccine, and now you can begin distributing it. And that's how COVID was able to roll out a lot faster than some of the other vaccines, was because they were manufacturing the vaccine while the trials were actually occurring. So they didn't cut out any of the clinical trials. There wasn't less studies done. I've heard people, even some friends ask me about that, like, well, they did less, no, they did the same research. They're required to go through the same steps. Things just kind of got fast-tracked. In other words, they were manufacturing the virus while they were doing those trials, and then their application was sort of at the top of the pile. So when they did go back to apply, there was an epidemiologist in San Francisco that explained it really well and said, really, they just cut out a lot of the bureaucracy on being able to apply and have it reviewed and have the committees go over it. That was a priority. So that got done a lot quicker than, let's say, if it was a different vaccine that wasn't as critical for public health. So all the studies, the critical part of that is that all the studies were done, all the clinical trials were done exactly as they would for any other vaccine or drug.
Judy, you want to add anything?
Well, I was going to say, and I heard that recently that they are moving very close to full FDA approval.
Yes,
because they're continuing to collect data, and obviously now millions and millions of people have received them. How well vetted is this now? And that they should be receiving full FDA approval soon. That'll still be much faster than a normal FDA approval, but they weren't ready for a full FDA approval, but they will be very soon.
So the emergency use authorization is like a fast forward. It makes sure everyone is safe. It prevents the spread of the virus, but we're still learning. Like, it still takes a little bit longer to get that full approval, and that's what we're going through right now, right? So with the full approval, we're going to have a much broader understanding of what the vaccines do. Is that correct?
Yes. After all clinical trials, even when a drug is approved, so let's say outside of the COVID, any drug that's approved, there's ongoing monitoring that happens. So just because something's approved doesn't mean, okay, let's just happen. They're still required to present studies or present their data back. And usually the CDC kind of takes over the surveillance on that. But then you present back your data to make sure that in the real world, it's still effective, and it's still years and years later still showing the effectiveness. So it's the same thing with COVID. So we've done the due diligence. I shouldn't say they've done the due diligence. They've done all the studies for it just like they would normally do. They were just able to manufacture it. So now they're distributing it. Now we're getting the data, especially from Pfizer, we're getting the data from the first responders that were in Illinois, the 1A group. So all that data is coming in, and it's all really super positive. So that's being presented back to the FDA pending the full approval. And then this will go on, even if they are fully approved. This data will still be collected, still be monitored, and still be analyzed to make sure that it's still efficient, effective, and safe.
Yes, it's ongoing.
It really is amazing. I mean, sometimes I think we picture 8 scientists in lab coats sitting in a room in Washington, but there's really this whole apparatus that's built up between the FDA and the CDC that's constantly working and constantly monitoring. So this is probably a good point. Can we talk about the 3 different vaccines that are actually approved in the United States, and maybe some of the differences in where we are with each of them?
Sure.
I'll start off. The Pfizer was the first one approved, and was the one that we were also so happy when that one finally got approval. Both Pfizer and Moderna are the mRNA that we spoke of. The difference between the Pfizer and the Moderna is that the Moderna actually has a higher dose of the mRNA in it, and because of that, it is a little bit more stable, is my understanding. So some of the restrictions as far as how it's stored and transported are a little bit less. And the recommended time between those 2 doses with Moderna is 28 days. With Pfizer, the recommended window between the two doses is 21 days, but they both are mRNA. They both require 2 doses at this point. There are studies looking at what would happen if we went to 1 dose. There's studies looking at, okay, so if Pfizer had 100 micrograms dose it per dose, as opposed to Pfizer had 30 micrograms per dose, which of those was actually the best? They're very similar. And then Johnson & Johnson is the third one. And the Johnson & Johnson is a single dose, although there are studies now looking at what would happen if we did a single dose of Johnson & Johnson and then a tiny little re-immunization, revaccination in a much bigger window. But Johnson & Johnson is right now a single dose vaccine. And like we alluded to earlier, it's a little bit different. It isn't actually injecting the mRNA, it's injecting a attenuated or altered virus. So Peter, you can go into more detail then.
Oh, that's great. I think that was a great synopsis of the 3 vaccines. The common side effects are pretty similar, especially between the Moderna and the Pfizer. Typically, injection site pain is very common. So some of my friends call it vaccine arm. Their arm hurts for a few days afterwards because it's an IM, it's an intramuscular injection, so it's going right into a muscle. So that can be sore for a few days. Fatigue and headaches are another very common side effect for it. Muscle aches, and then chills and fever are a little bit less common with that. But the side effect profiles for both, well, actually for all 3, are very mild. They're not serious reactions. The one reaction that you're really concerned about is an anaphylactic reaction, a severe allergic reaction, and that's the one that you're the most worried about in giving the vaccines. I think with the Pfizer, if I read correctly, out of 18 million doses, there was 11 anaphylactic reactions, no fatalities, but 11 people had severe allergic reactions to it out of 18 million. That's pretty good.
That's amazing.
Phenomenal. But that's why if you get a vaccine, they'll usually have you stay there for about 15 minutes because the reaction, that allergic reaction tends to happen very quickly. So they'll usually have you hang out for about 15 minutes just to make sure you have that. But that's really the most serious reaction that we're seeing so far.
Another difference between the 3 that I meant to point out is, as I alluded to, the Moderna and Pfizer have very stringent guidelines. They have to be kept very cold. Not every doctor's office or clinic has the capability to store those vaccines like they should. Johnson & Johnson, because it's a DNA instead of an mRNA, the guidelines are less restrictive, so it's more easily stored and it sort of has a longer shelf life, which makes it easier to distribute. I mean, if you think of some of the rural areas of Middle America where there may not be a place within miles that could store the Pfizer vaccine at the extreme cold conditions that are required, whereas Johnson & Johnson, any doctor's office freezer would reach the temperatures that it needs.
Yeah, just to add on to that, like out by me, I'm not really necessarily a rural area, but out by me, there was a problem with the refrigeration. So we were seeing a lot more of the Moderna because you could keep them at a regular refrigerated temperature, which most pharmacies had for up to 30 days. So we were seeing a lot more Moderna vaccine in our area because of the lower refrigeration requirements to store it compared to Pfizer.
And just one more question related to this kind of development of the vaccines. I've often heard in the media the term efficacy thrown around. Can you help us understand what that means?
Does it do what it's supposed to do? Does it do what it's supposed to do? So in regards to a vaccine, does it prevent you from getting the illness? That's the rigid term of it. And that's where some people have said, well, Johnson & Johnson doesn't have the efficacy, but that's getting the disease at all. Johnson & Johnson has been extremely effective, as effective as the others, in keeping people out of the hospital and off ventilators, which is in the end our end result. So although maybe with all 3, there are always going to be people who still get COVID, even though they got vaccinated with any vaccination. There's always some people whose immune system doesn't respond the way we expected it to. But with Johnson & Johnson, maybe there's a few more people who actually get the disease. But as far as being hospitalized or ending up in the ICU on the ventilator, Johnson & Johnson, those people do not end up in the hospital or on the ventilator either. So efficacy, the rigid definition is, do they get the disease or not? And so then Johnson & Johnson was a little bit lower. Just on another thing with Johnson & Johnson. Remember that they were developed later, and so the studies began later. They also studied for these initial phases a greater number of people across the world. And so some of these new strains, these more virulent strains, some of which do not respond to this vaccine as well, some of those were already out there when the Johnson & Johnson phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies were being done. So they think that that also affected the efficacy. So if you went back and studied some of these others under the same conditions, their rigid efficacy numbers might be a little bit lower too.
My neighbor just asked me about that too, was confused about the numbers and seeing different numbers and didn't understand what effectiveness, like there is reading effectiveness versus efficacy. Efficacy is determined during the clinical trials. So what they do is they compare, in the clinical trials, you have a control group that does not receive the vaccine and another group that does receive the vaccine, and they compare the two. So efficacy is the percentage of people that don't get COVID that are in the vaccinated group. So what you're looking at is, if you have the vaccinated group, when comparing it to the non-vaccinated group, what percentage of the people were not getting COVID? I read that the CDC or the FDA was looking for 50% efficacy. That's what they were hoping for, which means there'd be a 50% reduction. Your chances of getting COVID as a vaccinated person would be 50% less than a non-vaccinated person. They thought, that's great. Most vaccines were between 40 and 60% efficacy. Mm-hmm. The 3 vaccines we have blow that out of the water. So, I mean, you've got Moderna and Pfizer that are in the 90%, and Johnson & Johnson, which, like Judy said, it's a little bit lower. It's in the 70%. It was way over what they thought it would be. So those are phenomenal. That means you have a 70% less chance of getting COVID as a vaccinated person versus somebody that's unvaccinated. I mean, that's phenomenal. It really is.
And, it is interesting. We kind of treat vaccination as like this on-off thing. You take the pill, you've got it, or you haven't taken the pill, you don't got it. But it is, as you've said, it's a reaction. And there's a lot of variables that go into that. So there's, some people won't develop the same level of protection, right? And we need to keep that in our mind, that it is a biological process and not just this like magic wand that hits you and protects you, right? So.
And let me add one real quick thing to that. That efficacy number is based on the clinical trials. So then what they need to do is see how it's out in the real world. So now that they're actually giving vaccines, all that data is coming in to see what the actual effectiveness is. And the actual effectiveness is even higher than those numbers. So
yes. Johnson & Johnson
first responders numbers in the close to 100%.
Yes, that's correct for all of them.
That's just great. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, well, actually, I had a question specifically for Judy. Judy, I know you volunteered to administer the vaccine. Could you share a little bit about your experience doing that, and maybe give us some insights into what folks can expect when they go to a vaccination clinic?
Yes, I was able to volunteer at a vaccination clinic at one of our clinical sites where we take our nursing students, and that was in January when Pfizer was the only vaccine that was available, and it was a very positive experience. I did it before we began this semester, so it was when we were still on Christmas break, and it was the first wave of vaccines. So because it was at a hospital, people would come in and would check in, and I'm sure it's this way at others. So you have to check in, and first you're screened to make sure that you don't have any contraindications to receive the vaccine, and you're taught some of the side effects, and there's some teaching that goes on. And then there's documentation, because we want to track everyone who's had this vaccine. And once the record keeping is done, and they fill out that initial little card that everybody wants that has their information on it, then they were sent to we nurses who were administering the vaccine, which we again went through some of the checklists to make sure that there were no contraindications to them receiving the vaccine. I can tell you that in that room where we were vaccinating, it was a very positive vibe, because again, this was in January, and these people were the first wave of those being vaccinated. Lots and lots of selfies, the doctors, the nurses, the entire healthcare team, whether they were working in dietary or housekeeping or one of the therapy departments, no matter what it was, they were all there together, sitting there giving each other thumbs up while we were injecting them. And we had multiple stations set up, so there was a lot of activity. Once they were injected, then they were moved to an observation area, like you said, where they were asked to stay there for 15 minutes, and most of them were on and were still, taking selfies while they were sitting there for the 15 minutes to make sure that there were no reactions, and then they were allowed to go on with their day. There were some members of the community that were there as well, but it was overall a very positive thing. And then 2 weeks later, we came back to do the second round for these same people, and for some, it was their first round. But again, they were so excited, most of them, to be receiving their second vaccine and to be able to move on with their life. There were some people that were teary even while they were receiving it.
I think that excitement is still it's still around. I got my first dose last week, and it was just like people were smiling all over the place, even through masks. You could tell.
There were two older women. I still wish I had taken a picture of them. Older, much older than me. And they got together and they held their cards up and had us take a picture of them. The two of them with their cards with both injections. They were just so excited because now they were going to be able to see their grandchildren and travel and do all the things that they hadn't been doing in the past year. After 2 weeks, 2 weeks after their second.
Well, so it's been exciting and liberating in many ways for people who are getting the vaccine. But there's been some confusion around the rollout, and maybe it's been a little scattered. I don't know, from the perspective of a healthcare provider, can you comment at all on some factors that affect the rollout? What can we learn about this for future vaccine rollouts?
We're learning a lot, I can tell you that. Because, I mean, even what we're doing now with the massive rollout, because now the number, we're getting more and more vaccines available, and we're able to give more. Yesterday, I think they said 3.1 million per day the United States is administering now. So the ability to do that, we did not have that in January, which, that maybe is an indictment of us that we weren't ready for that. But I think we've all learned a lot about the logistics of distributing it, storing it, and administering it, and keeping records of what's going on. It's a very complicated thing. And and we haven't even touched on the disparity issues, that you wanted to be sure that the vaccine was available to those who were most affected by it. And many times they were in areas where maybe they weren't able to get to places where you normally would be distributing a vaccine. So we had there were many layers of things to be considered in the distribution of this. And there was a time period there where it was frustrating because there was so much vaccine in storage that we were hearing about, but we were having difficulty getting appointments or getting in. I think some of those layers are starting to fall away now, and it's becoming more available. But I think that everyone has learned a lot, and hopefully, the next time we'll have a much smoother unrolling of this.
Well, thank you. Troy?
Well, I think it's time to pull Laura into this conversation. She's been sitting so patiently. So thank you, Laura, for your patience as we've set up the kind of basics around vaccines. Let's shift gears then and talk about the psychology with our expert, and maybe to think about how the folks in the psychology world think about vaccines, and especially, some of the vaccine resistance that's out there.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I think that it's really, really important when we think about how people are processing this information and processing the pandemic. I think it's really important to recognize that although we all feel like we are completely rational and logical, maybe other people aren't, but we're all rational and logical, that really is not the case in a lot of our thinking. Most of our day-to-day behaviors, most of our thinking really follows shortcuts, things that social psychologists call heuristics. And that's because it would be really overwhelming for us to rationally and logically process all of the information that comes at us all of the time. We wouldn't be able to get out the door, in the morning. We wouldn't be able to do our jobs or interact with other people if we were rationally and logically processing every bit of information. And so there are all these shortcuts that we take. And they're usually pretty helpful for us. They help us sort through stuff that's important to us and get rid of the stuff that's not. But unfortunately, they can lead us, again, to not think rationally and to think in kind of predictably irrational ways. And so I think a lot of how these heuristics are employed, or I should say deployed, depends upon the group that you are embedded within. So what I mean by that is, if you are maybe a scientist and your friends are scientists and you watch science shows and you listen to science-based media, you're going to be hearing a lot of information that's positive about the vaccines. A lot of the things that everybody has been discussing here, you've already heard it, and you process that information, using like you're focusing on the information that's consistent with what you already believe. However, if you are embedded in a group of people, if your community around you really focuses on conspiracy theories or distrust of government or distrust of authorities, you're going to be hearing and seeing a lot of media, a lot of posts that are not accurate. And it can be difficult to parse through that when you are embedded within it, because you're paying attention to what's right in front of you. You're not necessarily logically thinking it through. Instead, you are just focused on what your group, what your tribe, what your community believes. And it can lead to some real big disparities in how people are seeing COVID and in how people are seeing the vaccine. I just actually got a link to a subreddit. I don't know if you guys how familiar you are with Reddit, but I just got a link to a subreddit from a friend just yesterday that's really focused on anti-vaccine information and that COVID is really just the flu and it's a big conspiracy and I mean it's post after post after post after post after post, and you have all of this confirmation coming at you. It can be difficult to pull yourself out of that.
I don't know if Judy or Pete want to add anything. Make sure you jump in if you want. If not, it's okay. I do think it's interesting. It's an interesting kind of thing that I think we deal with all the time, but we don't necessarily recognize it, where we don't get to live two lives and then figure out which decision is better. So I'm going to not get vaccinated and see what happens, and I'm going to get vaccinated and see what happens, right? You have to make a decision with the information at hand. And so, I mean, I find it understandable in some ways that people are hesitant, because once you get that jab in your arm, you can't just pull that out. And I've had friends say to me, I'm going to wait and see how what happens with everybody else. And I mean, I guess there's I wanted to ask, about that inherent kind of skepticism, and when is the skepticism healthy, and then when does it take a turn towards unhealthiness, right? And I mean, anyone that's had little kids, and you have to take your children to get vaccinated, that's been a hot debate for several decades. I mean, for a long time, as long as vaccines have been around, people have been spreading mistruths and misunderstandings about vaccines. So, sorry, kind of a convoluted question, but I'm interested in that idea of being skeptical and when skepticism is healthy, and then when it becomes unhealthy. And I don't know if you have. Yep. Go ahead.
Well,
go ahead.
One big group of skeptics are scientists.
Scientists. Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
you wouldn't think it. You think, oh, but scientists are huge skeptics. That's why they follow the scientific method. They don't just take things on faith. They go and they test it. They observe the things they see, and then they test it. And then they try and repeat the test. And then other people repeat the test to see before we truly believe in that. And even at that point, your most hardcore scientist still doesn't believe it totally, says, well, this is the best we have going for now at this point. But we're going to continue to test it over time and allow that thought to evolve. So I think that's the biased. I'm more science-based. I think that's sort of the way that I kind of try and look at the vaccines. I wasn't completely 100% confident that there would be a vaccine, a viable vaccine. Like back last March when we were talking, and I'm thinking coronavirus vaccine in a year? No way. I thought it would take years to develop that. So when it did come out, I wasn't like, yep, this is the, I went through the process of looking at it, researching it. But when you look at it through those eyes, and Laura brings up awesome points about, the way we look at things and the way that we're exposed to things can shape our perception of how we look at the facts. And there are different ways to look at the facts. But when I looked at the facts, I was super impressed with what I was seeing. And I was surprised at how positive the data was for things. So I think if you try and look at it through fresh eyes like that, I think you can come to conclusions. And also, there's a famous saying, trust but verify.
Right.
Trust what you're taking in, but still verify and still do your own due diligence and still look at your own research and come out of your whatever your perceptive bubble is and be able to look at different sources and see if they're saying the same things.
Yeah, I think that you make several excellent points. And to your comment about skepticism, Troy, I hear that a lot in the conspiracy theory community. And I hear a lot of people talk about do your own research, but the kind of research that they're talking about is different than the kind of research that maybe we're talking about. We're talking about maybe looking up information in scientific journals, or if not the scientific journals themselves, at least highly respected science media. When people who are really deep in down the rabbit hole with conspiracy theories talk about doing their own research, they're talking about getting information from other conspiracy theory websites. They're talking about getting non-verified blog posts. They're talking about hearing about this person's cousin's wife's daughter who knows this person who this bad thing happened to. And it's very driven by anecdotes. It's very driven by personal stories, personal narratives. This is what happened to me. You can believe me, but you can't believe those scientists because they've all been bought off. And so I think we're paying attention to different sources. So, I think it's an excellent point that science is founded on skepticism, and you have to be skeptical if you are a scientist. But at some point, you are looking at the information, the data that are in front of you, and at some point you have to say, this is what the data are showing. And come to a conclusion. And it's an ever-evolving conclusion. And that's something that I think a lot of people who aren't scientists get upset about and are confused about with science, is that it's always changing, right? So one year margarine is good for us, and then another year it's the devil. We should be having butter, we should be having less butter. Maybe we should start cooking with lard again. These one-off science stories come up, and people think, well, that's the end, that's the final answer, and that's not the case with science. Science is always evolving, it's always building, it's changing. So yes, just like you said, to verify, you have to verify the information first before you can fully trust it.
One thing that I've always thought is interesting from an information literacy perspective is that, in the general kind of discussion, facts are kind of treated as these concrete, solid, unchanging things.
Right.
But scientists don't really treat facts in that way, or knowledge in that way, right? They treat knowledge more as like a measurement. And as measurement gets better and we get new tools to measure, we learn new things. And the old facts that we used to hang on to change and adapt and become broader and become more detailed. And so sometimes I feel like we do ourselves a disservice, maybe it's within our education system, I don't know, or just how the brain is wired, but we want these solid things to hold on to. And what we need to is like recalibrate how we think about knowledge in some ways. Not to go on the philosophical tangent, but I think that is a useful way to think about it. Oh, Judy, you're on mute. Sorry.
That's why studying science and scientific inquiry is so important. There's a quote that says science is inherently self-correcting. So, I mean, knowing that, it implies that we operate from the truth as we know it, from what science has showed us at this point. I mean, and then science keeps questioning, and science keeps testing, and then you might found out another truth. So now you operate from that truth. I mean, like Galileo, when he thought that he was trying to question whether the Earth was the center of the universe, and he was punished as a heretic. But eventually, science proved that he was right, and we moved on from there. And I mean, there's many scientific principles that through the years that were accepted as fact, and then eventually science disproved it. And the willingness to constantly question and re-examine accepted facts is part of science.
This is probably a good point to mention, and Judy, you had mentioned this earlier, that COVID has really demonstrated some of the disparities in our healthcare system and has really had a major impact, especially on Black and Brown communities, a real unequal impact on Black and Brown communities. And, you know, that's not a direction that we're going super deep in today, but I wanted to mention we had a really excellent conversation about this last summer that Tish Hayes and I moderated with several of our nursing faculty and Amy Williamson from psychology about some of the history behind the distrust, especially by people of color within of the medical community, and with some good reasons behind that, of course, and then how we might be able to overcome that. So I just want to mention that and encourage anyone watching now to take a look at the library YouTube channel, look at our playlist about COVID, and you will find a discussion about health disparities and COVID, especially with some of our nursing faculty who were in ICU units, you know, on the front lines last summer when things were really, really bad. And so I want to just give that shout out and commercial for that event. It was a really great discussion. So thank you. And I'll turn it over. Hannah's got the next question.
Sure. So while we've been talking about some of the maybe societal or cultural reasons that people are skeptical of vaccines and science, but there are reasons that people may not be able to get the vaccine. Judy or Peter, do either of you want to talk about some of this, maybe from a medical perspective?
Sure. Not everyone is able to get the vaccine. There's some situations, for instance, if you've recently gotten another vaccine, so say someone recently got their MMR booster or something like that, they're not to get the COVID vaccine within, I believe it's 2 weeks of getting another type of a vaccine. So if you've recently been vaccinated for something else, then you wouldn't be a candidate for it. If you've had an anaphylactic reaction previously to a vaccine, these vaccines are in carriers. One of the carriers in the vaccines, excuse me, is polyethylene glycol. That's a common carrier. So if you've had an anaphylactic or a severe reaction to another vaccine, it may be that you are allergic to one of the carriers. Certainly, if you've had an anaphylactic reaction to the first of the 2 steps, then you wouldn't go back and get the second vaccine. If you currently are sick with COVID, you're not to get the vaccine. They're suggesting that 2 weeks after you get sick, you can get the vaccine. So even like if you get, say you get a Moderna vaccine and then several days later come down with COVID because you weren't completely immune yet, because the Moderna are over 2 weeks apart, you may not even have to change your date. So, you know, if you come down with COVID in between the two, you might have to change the second one, but you can still get the second one. If you currently have COVID, though, you should not go get the first one until you are completely clear of the COVID symptoms and the COVID virus. There's some other people, like initially the tests are still being done on pregnant women, but now the tests are showing that maybe the COVID virus is more dangerous to pregnant women, and that perhaps we should really be encouraging pregnant women to get the vaccine. So at this point, it's, talk to your obstetrician, but where initially they said, no, pregnant women shouldn't get it. Now they've kind of changed and they're saying, no, maybe we should encourage women who are pregnant to get it. So you're going to need to converse with your physician about that. Right now, age is one of the hardest cutoffs because the vaccines are not approved for those that are under 16, although there are lots of tests being done, like 12 to 15. They're saying that's going to be the next group it opens to is down to 12, and they are currently testing even younger. And eventually, I think that that even younger will be approved. But for right now, if you're under 16, you're not going to be able to get the vaccine, of course, unless you're part of one of these studies. Immunosuppressed patients need to talk with their physicians because, of course, this whole vaccine process that we've discussed depends on your immune system gearing up and responding to the vaccine. And some people, because they're immunocompromised, their immune system may have a difficult time doing that. I think that's it. Pete,
Autoimmune diseases too kind of fall into that same category. They're still recommending them, but the efficacy is not as established with it. So the research is a little murky on it.
Always check with your doctor if you have a specific question or a specific process. But yeah, the age is and history of anaphylaxis is probably the biggest one. Biggest ones.
Always good advice. Check with your healthcare provider. Well, so as more and more of us are vaccinated, it raises some issues about privacy and some ethical issues. For example, just kind of widely posing this, given that vaccines are approved for emergency use and they're going to be fully approved by the FDA soon, do we think that employers will be able to require that employees get vaccines, or how do you all feel about that?
That's a question that's out there. I mean, there's a lot of debate about this because, like we've talked about, these vaccines do not have full FDA approval yet. So they're as long as they're under EUA, emergency use authorization, it's a little bit more of a gray zone. Once they have full FDA approval, even then, it's difficult. For instance, I'm a nurse, and most hospitals will require their employees to get the influenza shot so that we don't spread it if there's a surge of it during the winter months. But there are healthcare employees who do not get the vaccine. So if some of them, it's a religious reason, some of them it's a medical reason, and so then they're still able to work, but then they always would have to wear a mask or things like that. I did see that there's a cruise line, and I don't think it's an American cruise line, that is requiring it of all of their employees as well as anyone that would enter their ship. So it may not be an American cruise line, but so it's started. There's an employer that's requiring full vaccination for COVID before you can work for them. We'll see what the future brings, though. There's a lot of points of contention within that.
I was looking at this. I read an article by a labor attorney for the U of I from U of I Champaign, and they asked him the same question: can employers mandate it? And he said he thinks so. So just so you know, the CDC does not regulate or mandate vaccines. It kind of comes to the state level. There have been points in history where employers or state institutions were able to vaccinate people. There was a case in 1905, which is, according to that attorney, the pending case that it was upheld in 1922. Jacobson versus Massachusetts went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was a Swedish pastor who, for religious reasons, said, I did not want to be vaccinated for smallpox. At the time, Boston had a huge outbreak of smallpox and was mandating everybody has to get vaccinated for smallpox, and he lost the case. The Supreme Court upheld that the state of Massachusetts had the right to vaccinate, and then that was again challenged in 1922, and it was still upheld. So Michael Leroy says that's kind of the case that it could fall back to if anybody questioned it. In 2018, there was a federal case, kind of similar to what you were talking, Judy. I did the same thing for nursing school. I was required to get Hep A vaccines, have my MMR vaccines, everything up. There was a healthcare worker who refused the MMR and sued the employer. The employer terminated her, and she said she took it to the courts. It was a federal court, but it wasn't Supreme Court. And they said it was okay for the employer to terminate as long as the vaccine was job related and followed consistent business necessity. And those were the two key things that the attorney that did this interview kind of keyed in on for future possible legislation if companies started mandating it and people started suing back. That the two things that the courts right now are looking at are job related and consistent with business necessity. There's always a couple of exemptions that have always kind of historically been in place, and you mentioned it, Judy, religious and medical. So if you have sort of different medical conditions or religious objections, as long as you're able to modify, like wear masks or social distance, as long as you're in an industry where you can do those things to offset the risk, that's okay. But those are the two exemptions that are normally kind of historically been in place to allow people to not be vaccinated when it was mandated.
Yeah. No doubt we will see some legal cases about this as it moves through. I saw in the mid 1800s in Britain, they required smallpox vaccine, and there was a parent who refused to vaccinate, because Troy, you mentioned it with kids, refused to vaccinate their children. And this was in Britain, they passed a law that the parents could be imprisoned if they did not vaccinate their children. I don't think it would go that far, but in our history.
Well, thank you. This is something I think we'll all think about much more as more people are vaccinated.
And as we're thinking about that, I'd like to pull Laura back in a little bit here and talk about the idea of media bubbles and how this impacts our trust in vaccines. You mentioned a little bit about this, but can you help us, flesh the idea out a little bit more?
Sure. So the information that you hold, the knowledge that you have, is a result of what you're seeing on a daily basis. And most of us now are connected to new information through social media platforms. They might be different, a variety of different apps. There's also a wide variety of different news channels as well, to serve the needs of different kinds of preferences. The problem with that, of course, is that you can choose which media, of course, you want to consume, but then also that media is chosen for you within these social media apps as well. And so what ends up happening is that you only get exposed to certain kinds of stories. You only get exposed to stories that are consistent with your point of view and with your friends' points of view. And, often, the people that you have in your friends circle are people that you agree with, because it's uncomfortable to talk to people that you disagree with every day. And so, when you have maybe old friends or family members that disagree with you, you tend to distance yourself from them, maybe not talk about these things as much, because it's uncomfortable to feel like someone that you care about disagrees with you. So as a result, what ends up happening is that you are exposed to information that is consistent with your viewpoint. You're not given information that is different from what you already believe. And then you talk to other people about the same information, and they tell you information that's also consistent with your viewpoint. And as a result, you're never challenged on your beliefs. You're never challenged on things that you are just assuming as fact, because everybody around you believes this same thing. When you look at some of the deeper conspiracies, like flat Earth conspiracy, it used to be that pre-internet times, because this came about before the internet, it was tough to hold that kind of viewpoint. You had to constantly argue with other people about it, and it was really tough to maintain, and it wasn't as popular, I think, because of that. But with the internet and with social media, you can find thousands of other people who have the same point of view. You don't have to talk to people who have a different point of view. And the social media platforms have algorithms that point you in the direction of things that they know that you're going to agree with, because we spend more time on social media when we are being told that we're right. It feels good to be right. So we're seeing, news stories, I'll put it in quotation marks, that are consistent with our beliefs. We're seeing posts from other people, testimonials, anecdotes, and everything like that are consistent. And that's what a media bubble is. Media bubble is you're just getting information that is consistent with your beliefs and your point of view. And unfortunately, it only serves to further embed you in those beliefs, and you're no longer thinking critically about them, and you're no longer questioning them. And obviously that can be a real problem.
It's a major information literacy challenge I think we have today. So yeah, thank you so much.
So I think building on the idea of the information that people get about the vaccine and about COVID, and I think maybe Peter and Judy, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it might be worth coming back to. So we've talked about how scientists work with the information they have now, and they work to continue to get more information and use new tools and new processes to learn more and to understand better. As a non-scientist, how would you recommend that people outside of the scientific community who are involved, how should we approach information from organizations like the CDC as it does change?
I think that, just as Laura was saying, you have to be open, look at a variety of sources, and understand that, like we were saying, science moves forward, and sometimes as it moves forward, it finds that some of the previous assumptions were not correct, or some things that we felt had been proven without a doubt. Actually, as we move forward, we proved that assumption was not correct, or what that maybe perhaps that fact wasn't correct. So we have to be open. I know last spring when there was information, it was the CDC was coming out with, sometimes it seemed like contradictory information day after day after day. But can you imagine if they said, no, wait, we're not going to say anything until we absolutely know for sure? There would have been a huge period of time where we would have received no information at all from the CDC. So they were courageously releasing the information as it became known to them. And sometimes, yes, one thing would seem to contradict another. And even now, things are changing week to week. And we have to understand that, and we have to go with it, that as more information comes in, and it may change what our thinking is.
And I just want to jump in and just mention that changing ideas is not a weakness. I think that it is sometimes viewed that way. And that's not at all the case. I mean, that again, it's a very foundation of science, is that information and our ideas evolve, and even really basic things, change over time. And as we get more information, Judy, I think, what you said about being courageous is right on the money. It does take courage to come out and say, we were wrong. We were wrong about masks. This is why we thought that it was a bad idea. We now have more information, and we are now changing our guidance. The cowardly way out would have been, the weak way out would have been to just hold on to your position, no matter what new information came. I think it's a different kind of perspective, and it's an unhealthy perspective to suggest that change is weakness. Change is inherent in everything, including information and knowledge.
Absolutely.
Can I just jump in and say, I have a good friend who will use that and say, well, they're going to change their mind, so why should I believe in any of it? And the thing that I always have to say to him is, well, then you could believe in anything. Like if you don't have at least some effort at evidence, then you just are throwing the cards up in the air and seeing where they land, right? So like, just because we change our mind, like you said, it's not weakness. Just because we change our mind doesn't mean that we throw away everything that's said. Yeah, we might get better information, and some things we say now might not be correct or might need to be altered. But it doesn't mean that everything we're saying now just gets thrown away and you can just do whatever you want. And that's, sometimes I see that, like, where that's that point where that skepticism gets so poisonous that I'm not going to believe anything because who knows what's right and what's wrong. Well, we have a pretty good sense of what is on target, and some of it will change. So throw that in.
Excellent.
Okay, I think we're ready for me to. We're moving along. Sorry. There is a recent article from the journal Nature, which is one of the most highly reputable scientific publications out there, by Nikki Phillips. And in this article, the author concluded that the coronavirus is here to stay. The coronavirus is not going away, and that we're never going to get to a point of COVID equals zero in our society, which I think is a little frightening, perhaps. And I wanted to just ask our three experts, how do you think about the future, and how do you envision at this point, from what we know, what is your vision for how we live with COVID and coronavirus?
I think they're right. COVID is here to stay, but we live with many other viruses that we haven't reached a zero point with. Measles, mumps, rubella. I mean, we receive vaccines and boosters for those as well. And I think that the SARS-CoV-2 is going to be another one of those viruses that is around. And we over time, we develop methods of dealing with it. And maybe as these new strains become available, we have to alter the vaccine and get a booster, just like we do with influenza each year.
I agree with you, Judy. And I think as we hear about the variants, the 4 different variants that are out right now, likely they will have to, this is my prediction, that they'll develop booster vaccines for those variants. It may become like a seasonal flu kind of thing where you get your flu shot every year, or, we'll just have to see how it mutates. What I read from the CDC is that they're just not sure at this point. It's murky with the variants. Certain vaccines are somewhat effective against them. Some are not as effective. The research is kind of coming in, so they're not sure, but it'll likely mean that they'll have to modify vaccines or provide boosters to those in the future. That's what I would predict would happen.
On the upside, I did read that these mRNA vaccines may be able to carry mRNA, so that lipid molecule may be able to carry mRNA from a number of different diseases. So you wouldn't have to get so many different vaccines. You'd get one that would carry mRNA of multiple diseases, go into your cells. Your cells would produce something that would help your body to develop the antibodies that would fight those specific diseases. So out of COVID may come a new way of vaccinating us where we may not need to receive as many pokes, so to say.
All right, thanks.
Well, I guess it's about time for us to wrap up, but let's just conclude by, I'm going to offer you all a chance to offer any final thoughts or ideas.
I think I would say get the vaccine. And we've talked about Johnson & Johnson, we've talked about Moderna, we've talked about Pfizer. Whatever you can get, whichever vaccine, please get it. It's 30 million people have gotten it so far, and like Pete alluded to, there's been very minimal side effects. It's safe, and it can make a difference in your life.
I think I would just add in, if you have someone in your life who is anti-vaccine or who is maybe questioning the vaccine, I would just say proceed with caution. There is a somewhat well-known effect called the backfire effect. It's also called reactance, that when you argue with someone about a core belief that they have, they tend to not only put up walls and not hear and process what you're saying, but their belief in their original idea can grow. It can become stronger. So their anti-vax platform can become stronger because you are arguing with them. So I would say tread with caution. Don't attack. If you have someone in your life who is anti-vax, be respectful. Don't call names, and I would focus more actually on personal stories and situations of people who did not get vaccinated, who experienced really severe coronavirus and had really bad outcomes. some recent research, and again, this is ever evolving, right? But some recent research suggests that if you focus more on the disease itself, you are more likely to change minds than if you just give people lots of facts about how safe the vaccine is. That focusing on the kind of the horrors of the disease gets through more than the vaccine is safe information. And then we also know that giving personal anecdotes and personal stories change people's minds a lot more, even though that's completely irrational. It changes people's minds more than reading, or hearing about a scientific study where 100,000 people, had this happen to them, and they had no bad effects. They got the vaccine, no bad effects. That information doesn't stick. But hearing about the person who maybe turned the vaccine down and then they got COVID, a few weeks later, and they were hospitalized, and all these bad things happen, that's the kind of thing that sticks with people. So again, if you have someone who's anti-vax in your life and you're looking to change their mind, remember, it's no guarantee that you can change their mind. Be sure you don't attack, be respectful, and go after the disease itself as opposed to the safety of the vaccine. At least that's where the research stands right now in psych.
It seems like the people that are the long haulers that get COVID and have to deal with, like, have bad outcomes for months and months.
Yeah.
Where the typical case might be a 10-day, 2-week kind of thing. That to me is very compelling kind of stories for people that are resistant, where they're weighing that risk, because the long haulers, they still don't understand and why certain people have it and certain people don't. It's so random, and it could be any of us. And so to me, that's very compelling, a good compelling reason to get vaccinated for sure.
Yeah.
I would just say, I'm pretty positive on the vaccines with the research that I've seen. I think it's has a positive individual effect and a positive societal, from a public health perspective, effect. But I do understand skeptics. I have friends that are skeptical. I, quite frankly, have family members that are skeptical. So I know people very personally and intimately that have, that are not anti-vax necessarily, but are skeptical. And so I'll direct my last comment to the skeptics. As we were talking about before, scientists are big skeptics. Scientists don't just take things on faith, and I would never ask anybody to just take things on faith or watch a panel and these people said vaccine's good, so we should go do it. Trust but verify. Go through the process of science. Look at your observations. Look at what you're seeing. Research it. Research it from various perspectives. Don't just look at just the perspectives maybe you're used to. Look at the perspectives, a broad perspective from lots of different sources. Analyze that data, take it in, and be open-minded. Have a diversity of thought, of willingness to look at things from different angles than what your mind has ingrained you to be. You know what I mean? And I think Laura could probably tell us about a psychological thing where people are just stubbornly stuck in their thought, and they don't even know why. They're just kind of stuck in the thought, and this is what I believe, and I've believed it for so long, and this is just, be open to the observations you have, be open to what people are saying, trust but verify, and follow that method of science. And I think you'll see some pretty good data out there.
And just to piggyback on what you said, I just thought I'd throw out there, be careful about the sites that you are doing your research on, because there's so many different sites out there, and a lot of them have really bad information. And so it's important to maybe look for some third-party sites that rate and evaluate news organizations in terms of level of bias, and see if you can find some that are more middle of the road, that are known for being trustworthy, that have been verified by panels of media experts, as opposed to just typing in safety of the vaccine into Google, because I don't want to sound conspiracy theorist here, but I mean, Google does have information on all of us, and they know what you are looking for. And they're going to give you information that's consistent with how you already believe. And so when you do your research, make sure that it's from trustworthy sites that are, have been examined by people who know how to evaluate the news. Are they sourcing their information properly, et cetera?
And of course, this is probably a good opportunity to say, come to your library. Your librarians are very happy to help you with your research and to help you understand the sources that you're looking at. So with that, let's wrap it up. Thank you all so much. This is such a great conversation. I appreciate your time and expertise, and thank you, Hannah, for working with me on this.